The dog trot is showing up in Quonset hut plans everywhere right now, and almost everyone explaining it gets the reason wrong. It is not a Southern aesthetic. It is not a design trend. It is a workaround for a structural problem, and it was invented 300 years ago for a building that had exactly the same problem a steel arch has today. Log cabins could not be modified. The walls were structural, so when a family outgrew one, they could not cut into it or extend it outward. What they did instead was put up a second cabin beside the first and roof the gap between them. A Quonset arch has that same limitation. The curved sides are the load path. You do not open them up. So the dog trot is not a style being applied to the arch. It is the native answer to what an arch actually is. Strip away everything decorative and a dog trot is 3 components. 2 enclosed living units, historically called pens. An open central passage between them, typically 8 to 15 feet wide, running all the way through from the front of the house to the back. And 1 continuous roof spanning the whole arrangement, including the gap. That is it. 2 boxes and a hole under 1 roof. The passage is the part that defines it. It is not a hallway because it is open at both ends and open to the weather. It is not a porch because it runs through the middle of the building rather than along the front. You walk outside to get from one half of your house to the other, and that is a feature rather than an oversight. The traditional version put a chimney on the far gable end of each pen, so heat entered each unit from the outside edge and worked inward. Many of them carried a full-width porch along one eave wall as well, adding more shade and more airflow. You will hear it called several things depending on where you are: dog run, possum trot, breezeway house. The names all point at the same thing, and the most common one comes from the obvious. That shaded central passage was the coolest place on the property in August, so the dogs claimed it. One thing worth fixing in your head right now, because it changes how the rest of this makes sense. A dog trot is not a style. Nothing about the siding, the roof pitch, the windows, or the trim makes a building a dog trot. It is a floor plan, an arrangement of masses and a void, and it can be executed in logs, in brick, in timber frame, or in corrugated steel. Which raises the question almost nobody asks about it. Why would anyone build a house with a hole through the middle in the first place? Because the alternative did not exist. Trace the form back, and it starts with Swedish and Finnish settlers arriving in North America in the 1600s, carrying a log building tradition that included something called the pair cottage, 2 cabins set a short distance apart and joined by a roof over the intervening space. German settlers brought related methods into the middle colonies through the late 1600s, and from the 1730s onward, German and Scots-Irish families carried the tradition south and west into Appalachia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and eventually Texas and Louisiana. Now here is the constraint that produced it, and it is the sentence this whole video turns on. Log cabins were limited in size by the timber a man could actually handle. Length, width, and height were all governed by what could be moved with manpower and horsepower, and longer logs carried more taper, which made them less useful the bigger they got. So there was a hard ceiling on how large a single cabin could be. That alone would only have limited the size. What made the dog trot inevitable was the second half. A log cabin's walls were structural, and they were not easily modified. You could not cut a wide opening through them. You could not knock out an end and push the house outward. The walls were the building, in the same way the shell of an egg is the egg. So, when a family outgrew a cabin, a third child, an aging parent, a married son, the only practical move available was to build a second cabin beside the first one. Then somebody roofed the space between them, and the dog trot existed. The passage was a byproduct. The pair was the point. That distinction matters, because a constraint that's specific does not show up often, but it has shown up again. It has shown up again in corrugated steel. A Quonset arch carries its load down its curve. The panel that sheds rain at the peak is the same panel resisting snow at the shoulder and the same panel transferring everything into the foundation at the slab. There is no frame underneath doing the work. The shell is the structure, in exactly the way a log wall is the structure, which produces the same set of restrictions 300 years later. Openings on an arch belong in the flat end walls. Manufacturers state it directly. Doors and windows go in the end faces, because the curved sidewalls are load-bearing, and cutting into them requires additional engineering and additional cost. You can do it. You just cannot do it casually, and you cannot do it after the fact on a whim. Width is fixed the day you order. An arch comes in set widths, and while you can extend the length by adding sections, you cannot make a finished building wider. There is no bumping out the north side in year 6. And the sidewalls cannot take a hallway. The single most common thing people want when they connect two buildings. A conditioned corridor running between them asks you to cut a wide opening through the exact surface holding the roof up. So read the list back. A shell that is also the structure. Openings restricted to the ends. A width you cannot change. Walls you should not cut. That is a log cabin described in steel. And the answer American settlers reached for, when they had those constraints and needed more house, was to stop trying to modify the building and put a second one beside it. This is why the Dogtrot Quonset is not a novelty. It is the oldest correct answer to the problem the arch actually has. Compare it to the other layouts circulating in this space. The H shape puts two long buildings parallel with a connecting section between them. The U shape does the same thing with the connector at one end. The L shape turns a corner. All three look excellent on a drone shot, and all three ask you to do the same thing. Join two arches along their sides. That is the one connection the structure resists. Every junction like that means an opening cut into a load-bearing curve, reinforcement framing designed for it, and an engineer's stamp before your building department will look at the drawings. On a two-wing plan, you are doing it twice. The Dogtrot asks for none of that because it does not connect the buildings at all. Two arches stand a set distance apart. Each one is structurally complete on its own, with its own foundation, its own end walls, its own load path down its own curve. Nothing is cut. Nothing is reinforced. Nothing needs a stamp beyond what each individual building already required. The only thing spanning between them is a roof, and a roof over open air is a far simpler thing to engineer than a hole through a wall that is holding a building up. There is a second cost avoided, and it is the one I think people underestimate. The arch's quiet durability advantage is that it has no roof-to-wall joint. One continuous piece of steel from the slab on one side to the slab on the other, with no flashed seam for water to work at over 40 years of freeze and thaw. Cut a junction into that curve, and you have just built the seam back in, at the exact place the design was engineered, never to have one. The Dogtrot leaves both shells intact. And then it does something useful with the gap. The gap is where the Dogtrot earns its reputation, and the physics is straightforward. Wind approaching two structures set close together does not simply pass between them. It gets squeezed, and squeezed air accelerates. Architects call it the Venturi effect, and the early settlers worked it out empirically long. Before anyone put a name on it, they noticed that the movement of air between two buildings was intensified. So the passage becomes a channel. Even a mild breeze picks up speed running through it, and because the space is roofed and shaded all day, the air standing in it stays cooler than the open ground on either side. Then comes the part that actually cools the house. That accelerated air creates a low-pressure zone in the passage. Open the doors and windows facing the breezeway, and the pressure difference pulls warm air out of the rooms and drags cooler air in behind it. You are not just shading the middle of the house, you are running a pump. That is why the coolest spot on an old southern farmstead was the passage itself, and why the dog slept there. Two details matter for making it work. The passage wants to be aligned with your prevailing summer wind, which in much of the country means running it roughly north to south. And the flanking rooms need operable openings facing into it, because a breezeway with sealed walls beside it is just a covered walkway. Frank Lloyd Wright understood this well enough to build it deliberately. At Taliesin West, begun in 1937, a central breezeway used the same effect to draw cool desert air through the complex. Now here is why the arch cooperates with this better than almost any other building. The openings a Dogtrot needs are end wall openings. Doors and glass facing into the passage on the flat faces of each building, which is exactly and only where a Quonset permits them. Every other layout fights the arch. This one uses the openings the arch already allows. Building 1 is less complicated than most people expect because there is no clever engineering involved. You are placing two ordinary buildings and roofing the space between them. Start with the gap because it is the only dimension with real judgment in it. The historical range runs 8 to 15 feet, and there are reasons at both ends. Too narrow, and the passage becomes a corridor you hurry through rather than a room you use. Too wide, and you lose the squeeze that accelerates the air, which was the whole point. Then the roof over that gap, which is the one genuinely custom piece of the project and the one you should not improvise. Now the advantage that matters most on a real budget. This layout phases better than anything else in alternative building. Because the two arches are structurally independent, you can put up the first one, finish it, move into it, and add the second 3 years later when the money exists. Phase 2 does not touch Phase 1. Nobody is cutting into a wall of the house you are living in, and nobody is re-engineering something you already occupy. Compare that to an H or a U, where the connection is structural and the whole plan is essentially one project. For the layout itself, the modern convention splits by function. One wing holds the public room's kitchen, living, dining. The other holds the private ones, bedrooms, a home office, a guest room. The breezeway becomes the seam between how you live in front of people and how you live away from them. The old southern version had a sharper reason for the split. The kitchen went in the separate pen deliberately, which moved the largest heat source out of the sleeping quarters and, when a stove eventually set something on fire, kept you from losing the entire house. Practical then. Still practical now. Now the honest limits, because this layout asks something of you that a single building does not. You go outside to get from one half of your house to the other every time. Groceries from the kitchen wing to the pantry, a child from bed to breakfast, anything at 2 in the morning. In April, that is charming. In a Missouri February, with wind driving through a passage that was engineered specifically to accelerate wind, it is a decision you make several times a day. Understand where this form comes from. It developed across the humid South Louisiana, Alabama, Texas, the Carolinas, where the enemy was summer, not winter. The breezeway is a cooling device. North of the Ohio River, it is a cooling device you also have to walk through in January, and plenty of northern builds end up glazing the passage in, at which point you have given up the ventilation and built a very expensive hallway. Then drainage, which is the detail that separates a good build from a leaky one. You are roofing between two curved buildings, so water sheds off both arches toward the same gap. That water has to be collected and taken somewhere, and in snow country the passage becomes a place where drifting piles up between two structures. This is worth an hour with someone who has detailed it before. Then the arithmetic. Two buildings means two foundations, two sets of end walls, two door and window packages, and two structures to heat and cool. The Dogtrot buys structural simplicity by spending on duplication and on a small footprint that trade can go the wrong way. Everything else about arch construction still applies. Closed cell encapsulation on both shells, no gaps, no shortcuts. And financing does not improve because there are two of them. Two things killed the Dogtrot, and both were improvements. The first was manufacturing. By the 1880s, factory-milled lumber and cheap nails were widely available, which meant a builder no longer had to work within the limits of what a log could do. Walls stopped being structural in the old sense. You could frame a house any shape you wanted and add onto it later. The constraint that created the Dogtrot simply dissolved. The second was mechanical cooling. Once a compressor could do the work, nobody needed a passage engineered to accelerate wind. So the form faded, and for most of a century it survived as heritage architecture, something you visit in Louisiana rather than something you build. What brought it back is not nostalgia. It is that the constraint returned. A steel arch reintroduced the exact condition that produced the Dogtrot in the first place. A shell that is also the structure, openings restricted to the ends, and walls you do not cut. Give people that problem, and they arrive at the same solution, whether they know the history or not. Here is what I want you to do before you go any further with this plan. Find out which direction your prevailing summer wind comes from on your specific piece of land, not your region, your land, where trees and hills and the shape of the ground change everything. Your state climatology office publishes wind roses, and your county extension agent will know. Then walk the site and ask whether you can actually run a passage along that line, given your driveway, your setbacks, and your view. Because a Dogtrot pointed the wrong direction is two buildings with a windy walkway between them, and the orientation gets poured into concrete on day one. Post your prevailing wind direction and your state in the comments. I read them.